Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my thanks also to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this. It's been a really stimulating couple of days, and I've learned a lot, appreciated a lot, all the things that people have presented. I'm an unlikely choice to comment on a paper on Mozambique. I've been there exactly once for 3 days when I didn't leave Maputo. I think at the IMF that would probably qualify me as an expert, but I think for this crowd, I hesitate. So in that spirit, and given that Benedito has done a really nice job of presenting the case study, I'm going to divide my comments in two parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about transformation in Mozambique, from what I can understand, and then touch a little bit on some broader issues that I think might be relevant. I think the Mozambique case is a really provocative one. This is a case, and we've talked about several of them over the past couple of days, of slow structural transformation, and structural transformation that's occurring without any real agricultural development driving it. And I think this relates to a lack of articulation between urban and rural areas, which is not uncommon in a number of the countries that we're talking about. One of the things that seems to be a bit of a puzzle is that in many of the countries we're talking about, growth in the non-agricultural sector doesn't seem to be pulling behind the rural areas very much. And in the old days, I think people would have talked about this as enclave development. There was a big literature on this. We don't talk about it so much in those terms, but I think that's what we're getting at in the case of Mozambique and in some of the other, it's not an atypical pattern in African countries. So how should we think about structural transformation when the rural and urban economies, I think the Marxists like this word disarticulated. I don't really know what it means, but it sounds right for this. And so here the situation is that agriculture is accounting for 20 to 30% of GDP in Mozambique and 60 to 80% of the labor force, depending on how you measure. And that implies big productivity differences in the Macmillan-Roderick way of defining things. Just average productivity between sectors must differ by a huge amount. And the absolute levels of output per worker in agriculture that are implied by that suggest a very low productivity sector. In the agriculture sector, what you seem to have are lots of households living in quasi-subsistence. So people are producing food for themselves and selling a little bit of tobacco, maybe a little bit of cotton, a little bit of cashew nut, with which they're purchasing some non-agricultural goods or some goods that they can't home produce. And I would put it to you that when we're talking about structural transformation, it is this kind of quasi-subsistence sector that we're really interested in shrinking. The challenges faced by farmers, by these quasi-subsistence farmers, are the same in Mozambique to some extent as they are in the other countries we've talked about. Remoteness, high fluctuations in rainfall, prices that are weak at the farm gate and highly seasonal, low prices of output, high prices of input. You don't have to look very far, given the factor prices and the prices of outputs and inputs, to explain why productivity levels are low. Having said that, and this is well known, but I think in Ghana and any place else in Africa that I talk about agricultural productivity, I think it's important to emphasize that there are parts of the world where you can have small farms that are highly productive. That's the situation in much of Asia. It's the situation in much of Latin America, although Latin America is a little more complicated. Average farm size in Asia, most countries, very small. So the idea that people have here that you can only be productive if you're big is not the right story here. Yield and yield levels, this is again a lousy measure of productivity. We'd like to have TFP or something. Mozambique has low yields. It has low yields relative to its neighbors. I think the more interesting story is that it hasn't always had low yields relative to other countries. So I'll show you a couple of pictures very quickly because I don't have much time. But I want to suggest that there's been some significant divergence in yield levels over time. So here's Mozambique on the left relative to averages in East Africa, and then a couple of countries that I pulled out that you could argue are vaguely agroclimatically similar: Brazil, Colombia, and Paraguay in South America, Thailand and Vietnam. So these are, just quickly look at yield comparisons for cassava, for maize, for rice. So this is taking an average from 2005 to 2008. Mozambique's far behind. But here's a graph just showing trends in yield for maize from 61 to 2009. Here's Mozambique. At the beginning of the period, it's not noticeably less productive than any place else. And it is in cassava, but other places start to take off. And there's not much happening in yields in cassava. For rice, again, Mozambique starts off in the same place as everybody else and falls further behind. So I think you can understand this there are a lot of ways to understand this, but part of the story is surely about technology and about agricultural research. With Shangan sitting here, I don't probably have to make that argument too strongly, but it is noticeable that if you look at the data, the agricultural research sector in Mozambique, as in a number of other sub-Saharan countries, hasn't received that much funding. Funding hasn't increased in the last 7 or 8 years. Staffing levels have gone up. These are data from ASTI, the wonderful IFPRI-organized project that's collected data on science and technology indicators for agriculture. This is expenditures on agricultural research from 2004 to 2008. They're pretty flat. This is the share of staff. I think the number that sticks out is that there are something like 25 PhD ag scientists working in the entire country. It's a big country, a lot of different production systems, a lot of different crops. So let me switch away from talking about Mozambique, having exhausted what little I know, and just touch on this issue of enclave development and bring it back to some of the discussions yesterday about dual economy models. And I think in the taxonomy that Stefan presented yesterday, the assumption that I thought was kind of interesting is that whether you have a Lewis sector or a neoclassical model, so all of these seem to have an urban and rural sector that were assumed to trade pretty freely with each other. And what we're seeing and hearing from all of the country case studies is that part of this disarticulation between urban and rural areas is related to high transport costs and transaction costs. Some of those are related to poor infrastructure. Some of them are related to market imperfections, imperfect competition in transport, perhaps. Control of the marketing, cartels in the marketing system, as Elizabeth talked about yesterday. I think the other thing that we've talked about just a little bit, but the globalization of consumption patterns, which I'll expand on in just a second. I think I can do it, 2 minutes. We see a lot of urban growth in sub-Saharan countries, which is drawing heavily on food imports rather than on domestic foods. And I think partly that's a transportation cost story. In a lot of coastal cities, it's just cheaper to bring the food from Duluth, Minnesota to Dar es Salaam or to Accra than it is to bring it in from the interior. And I think the other piece, though, is that changing tastes and time values have done a lot to shift the mix of consumption in cities. You have urban populations that are heavily exposed to international marketing campaigns, and also rising value of time increases the demand for convenience foods, for rice and wheat in particular, but for a whole range of processed foods, rising value of women's time in particular. And what that implies to me is that that's going to create a big barrier to reconnecting some of these cities with their rural hinterlands. I think we can't assume in that environment that growth in non-agricultural areas, growth in urban employment, is going to pull the agricultural sector or the rural populations along with it. I think we're going to see very different patterns of structural transformation depending on whether the growth is starting in the cities in non-agricultural activities or whether it's starting in someplace else. So just to think of Mozambique, where the structural transformation is coming from at the moment and projects to be coming from over the next couple of years is from the mining sector. I wouldn't expect that kind of productivity growth in the economy as a whole to have much impact on the rural agricultural economy. Ghana has export agriculture. People talk a lot about getting cocoa going again here. That might have less effect on the urban economy. It's not clear that that's going to create lots of linkages to urban activities. I think increases in food productivity, we have reasonable theoretical reasons to believe have more of an impact on these kind of two-sector models of structural transformation than either of the other two. Okay, let me wrap it up. Almost on time here. So growth patterns in Mozambique suggest structural transformation with very little agricultural development. It shouldn't be a surprise either in terms of where the growth is coming from in the mining sector, or in terms of the attention that's been given to agricultural technology and agricultural investments in the past. The current strategy, which is heavily focused on these development corridors linked to the mining sector, I wouldn't expect to have big impacts on the subsistence, quasi-subsistence agricultural sector. So on that note, let me stop. Almost on time, I think, and thank you, Mr. Chair.